Hey there, guys. In this video, we're going to be talking about all things brain related. You are going to be responsible on your own to learn most of the brain functions or parts and functions. We'll go over some in these notes here, but the vast majority of them are in your book. So you should make sure you read them and do the homework assignments that are associated with the parts of the brain. So let's just kind of dive right in and talk about what we know about this 3 pound ball of mushy tissue that sits in our skull, and talk about how we can learn about it, what type of methods do we use to study it, as well as what some of the parts do and how it all works together. So let's just kind of dive right in. So first, we're going to start talking about the methods that we can use to study the brain. And since it's really hard to study a live brain, we have developed a number of technologies and scans that allow us to do so. So you will need to know these, and you'll need to know what they do and how they work. An EEG, or an electroencephalogram or electroencephalography, is used to measure electrical output of the brain. So we know that the neurons in our brains and our nervous system operate on chemical charges, right? Positively and negatively charged ions. Well, there's electrical activity associated with that, and the EEG measures that. This is relatively easy, I think, to remember because EEG stands, electro is in the name, and encephalo for the record is just means brain. So it's an electrical brain scan. And it usually works with a swim cap kind of looking thing that's got electrode measures on it, and you just kind of sit there and it just measures the electrical activity in the brain. They usually do this with resting activity, so you're just kind of sitting there not doing anything, or they can do it to specific things like they're making you afraid, and they can see which neurons are associated with that, or what parts of the brain those neurons are in. So an electroencephalogram shows function, not structure. This is a critical thing that we're going to be looking at throughout these different scans. Function meaning brain activity, structure meaning like parts of the brain and damage to certain parts of the brain. Next up, we have the fMRI, or really an MRI in general. So an MRI, as we saw in class with some of those videos, shows us structure very, very well. Very, very well. Very clear image of how the brain should look. In fact, on this image here, you can see it on the guy's computer screen, on the tech's computer screen. You can see from here, I can see, the cerebellum, the corpus callosum, the thalamus, in pretty strong detail. So an MRI shows structure, but an fMRI shows function, hence functional MRI. What this does is it measures oxygen to the brain, and it can then show you specifically what parts of the brain are active during certain stimuli. So if you're in an MRI machine, sometimes they'll put a little TV camera in there, and they'll show you, scary stimuli, happy stimuli, make you think about something, ask you questions, and they can measure in a laboratory setting the parts of the brain that are functioning when you think about those things or when you're responding to those things. So an MRI shows structure, and fMRI shows both structure and function, right? It can show you the parts of the brain and where the thought processes are connecting. Now let's look at CT scans. CT scans are really just like a fancy X-ray that the camera spins around the body, and they can then reassemble the different images that the X-ray is taking to create a 3D image. CT scans show structure. They do not show function. Okay. And you can see it here in this image that it looks like that there's a tumor somewhere in the middle of the brain there, based off of this CT scan. So again, CT scans are basically X-rays that spin around the body that will eventually create a 3D structure if you put all those images together. But it does show structure of the brain. There are a few other ones. There's PET scans that deal with they inject a radioactive uh, polymer or isotope or something of glucose, and then they can see, as that is getting absorbed, which parts of the brain is using more energy uh, because it's absorbing more of that sugar, which is the radioactive sugar, and then it lights up on the screen. There is a Google form with a table on it that has, I believe, 6 different brain scan techniques, and you're going to need to know them because it's an important thing to have down for our class. Would you recommend this test or that test based off of whether or not something is looking for structure or function? So please make sure that you guys understand what those are. Okay, let's talk some brain structures here. So there are some structures that are below the cortex, that are above the brainstem and the midbrain, but not quite onto the wrinkly outer cortex of the brain. First up is the thalamus. The thalamus is the kind of center thing. It basically is the top of the spinal cord, if you just follow it all the way up from the brainstem. The thalamus is the routing station for all of the senses. So all sensory input goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus routes it back out. It's kind of like an old school telephone switchboard. If you've ever seen in old movies where they take the thing out and plug it in over here, that's essentially what the thalamus is doing. So that information can be processed by the cortex, which is where a lot of our deeper processing occurs. The basal ganglia is that kind of web-looking thing that surrounds the thalamus. The basal ganglia play a very important role in voluntary movement, so determining how to move and whether or not to move, choosing to move, show that's where the basal ganglia comes into play. If people are moving impulsively, compulsively, whether that's ADHD or obsessive compulsive disorder, some twitches that kind of like a nervous twitch or something like that. That's all basal ganglia related activity. Okay. Next, let's talk about the limbic system. The limbic system is basically the lizard brain part of our brain, if you want to think of it that way. And that is directly related to our ability to process memories. Okay. So emotion and memory are very, very tied together, which you can see in this diagram here. Okay. So first up is the hypothalamus, which literally means below the thalamus. It's the structure there that is literally seated at the bottom of the thalamus. And if you remember from our endocrine system notes, the hypothalamus is in control of the endocrine system. It is what dictates to the pituitary gland what all the other glands in the body should be producing. The hypothalamus is also in charge of kind of the body's thermostat. It's what's in charge of keeping homeostasis, so making sure blood pressure doesn't get too high, our body temperature doesn't get too high. Those kind of more automatic things, or actually more specifically, the autonomic nervous system is very much regulated by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also related to another of other functions that are related to our survival, which we will talk about in class. The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure at the end of the hippocampus, really. This is tied strongly to intense emotional reactions. So a lot of times people say that fear is where the amygdala is the part of the brain that deals with fear. That's true, but it also deals with any strong emotion is processed through the amygdala, okay? So notice how that's close to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that deals with memory, with formation of new memories, what we call episodic memory. Long-term memory is created with the hippocampus. So, of course, things that provoke a strong emotional response in us tend to be the things that we remember. That's how the body is designed to work because of how close the amygdala is to the hippocampus, okay? Combined, these two brain structures kind of focus our memory on the more emotional things, which again you can see as being an adaptive quality that our brains have. And then finally is the cingulate cortex, which kind of wraps around the whole thing. It kind of goes around the corpus callosum there. And this is also just also related with memory and emotional responses to memory, how our memories are encoded with emotions attached to it. That's the cingulate cortex. So those are just a handful of the brain structures you're going to need to know. Make sure that you guys are staying on top of that. Another thing that you're going to need to know are the different lobes of the brain, which I'm going to show this image here and go through the different divisions of the lobes, because this is something you guys are going to need to know as well. So first off, you have all of these, the wrinkles of the brain are called gyri or a gyrus, okay, is the singular, gyri is plural. And you can see that between the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, the red and the yellow there, there's looks like a deeper division, okay? And that is a division between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, okay? The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that's like right behind the forehead. It goes back to about the middle of the brain here. And then the stuff behind that, but not to the back of the head, the stuff behind that is called the parietal lobe, okay? The lobes that are on the sides, kind of like the wings that fall over like by our ears, those are the temporal lobes. And at the very back of the head is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is responsible for vision. That's why our occipital lobe is so big, because we're very visual creatures. It deals with our visual processing and how we interpret the world visually. Temporal lobes, next to the ears, they also process auditory information. Our primary auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. Now, a couple of things to talk about with the motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. The frontal lobe, the primary jobs of the frontal lobe are things like decision making, planning, judgment, etc. So it makes sense that our motor cortex, right, our primary motor cortex, is located in the frontal lobe. I need to decide to get up and go for a walk. I need to see something coming at me and move out of the way. I need to, write this information down in the notes, and I need to be able to control my hand as I'm doing it. The primary motor cortex is at the end of the frontal lobe, but it is in the frontal lobe again, because that is where we're making decisions, planning, judgments, etc. The parietal lobe is more about kind of that like background information. So the sensory cortex, the somatosensory cortex, is in the parietal lobe. Remember, soma means body. So the somatosensory cortex is the part of the brain that is receiving sensory information from the rest of the body. So that could be location, like touching things on your skin, or you feel something on your back. That information is coming to the brain at the somatosensory cortex, okay, which is the beginning part of the parietal lobe. Now, there's a really cool thing that happens with the parietal, with these two cortices, the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. And that's, the brain has built into it a map of the body, which seems kind of strange. But if you were to undergo brain surgery and they were to stimulate a part of your somatosensory cortex that was associated with, say, your hand, you would feel that there was something on your hand when they were stimulating that part of your somatosensory cortex. Likewise, if they stimulate part of your motor cortex, let's say it's your leg, it's your lower leg, you would start kicking it out based off of basically tricking the brain into responding to this information. And that's called the homunculi, or a homunculus, which basically means little person. And it's called that because literally our brains have on them maps of our body. So if you look at this, on the right-hand side of this screen is the primary motor area of the cortex. And you can see a couple things. The larger the area is on the cortex, the more control you have over that. So think about, how much important and fine detail is needed to move your hands and your fingers, right? Being able to manipulate things with your hands is extremely important for humans, as is speaking and facial expression. So you'll notice how much of our primary motor cortex is devoted, literally the real estate on your brain is devoted to these things that are extremely important to humans. Likewise, on the somatosensory area, the larger the area over there, the more sensitive it is to sensation. So you'll notice things like your shoulder and your trunk and your elbow are very, not sensitive. It's hard to pick up sensation there. If you've ever played that game where you have to tell when the finger's in the crease of your elbow, it's really hard. It's because we don't have a lot of sensation there. But things like our lips or our fingers are very sensitive, so they take up larger area on the map here. Now, something that is also there, you can see feet, right? The feet are very sensitive, right? Feet, that's why people are ticklish on their feet, or it hurts when you stub your toe. But also you'll see that that's where the genitalia are, right? Obviously genitalia is sensitive, so that is part of the brain. Now, another kind of cool thing to think about is how the brain is structured, right? So this is the map of the brain if we were to combine the two hemispheres together, right? So this is essentially the map, the brain looking forward or backwards, I guess. Well, no, hold on. Yeah, actually, it doesn't matter. Left. So this is the brain looking forward. If you think of it this way, look at the parts of the brain that are internal, right? So that would be in between the hemispheres. That would be the genitalia for the somatosensory cortex, as well as the feet. Also, feet and ankle, again, on the motor cortex, which means that those areas are a little protected. You can imagine being hit in the head with a pretty serious blow that could, disrupt the way that our body processes motor function on things like our lips, which would make it hard to talk, or our hands, which would make it hard to grasp things, right? But what is kind of protected just by the shape of the brain are the toes, right? Are the feet, which is important because pretty much no matter what happens, you might be able to get up and walk away. Same thing with the sensation thing. If you have damage to the somatosensory cortex, with your hands might be paralyzed, but notice that the genitalia, right, reproduction, are probably still sensitive and probably still work, as well as the toes and feet, right? Being able to feel as you're walking the ground below you and making sure you're not tripping and things like that. So to me, this is the amazing part of the brain, that it kind of protects the most basic biological functions, right? Us being able to move and survive away from predators, and also our ability to pass on our genes to the next generation are kind of protected just in the shape of the brain. Now, speaking of genes, that's a perfect tie-in and a place for us to end, because the next unit we're going to be talking about is genetics, and stay tuned for that video coming up next.